This is CBC News. Good evening, I'm Martina Fitzgerald. This is the world this weekend. Tonight, offering assurances.
If you can't go home because it isn't safe, or because you don't have a home, we're not going to forget you.
A pledge to shore up Canadian charities. Also, admonishment and enforcement.
The reckless few, shame on you. If you can't do your part, law enforcement will do it for you.
Nova Scotia's premier delivers a scolding to those who don't abide. And bigotry and blame.
They're just afraid, whether it's to protect their families or from a backlash against anti-Chinese sentiment.
Gun sales surge with Asian Americans worried about self-protection. That's later. First, billions of dollars are earmarked to keep Canadian families and businesses functioning. But on this day, the focus is on helping those who help others. The federal government is giving money to charities that are in the thick of the fight against COVID-19. But as Catherine Cullen reports, there are many more groups that say they are also in dire need of support.
Haven't seen your friends, not able to go to school.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says he knows it can be hard to be a kid right now.
And you're watching the world you know change radically.
To help deal with their concerns, the Prime Minister encouraged young people to reach out to Kids Help Phone and announced $7.5 million in funding for the group. He also talked about helping seniors.
Maybe they're feeling particularly alone.
He announced $9 million to the United Way, money to help get groceries and medication to seniors and help connect them to community supports. But across the country, it is the charities themselves that are now saying they're in desperate need of help.
It is an existential crisis. It's also a very real crisis, a very real threat.
Dr. Samantha Nutt is the founder of War Child Canada, which helps children in communities affected by conflict. She's also part of the Emergency Coalition of Canadian Charities, which now includes more than 200 members, everyone from the Humane Society to groups that help those suffering with cancer.
I've been going in and out of war zones for 25 years. Like everybody else, I've never confronted something on the scale that we have seen with COVID, and I'm really worried.
She says charities are losing out on donations and volunteers. And Dr. Nutt says, unlike some businesses, charities don't have reserve funds for a rainy day.
Every week that passes, organizations are having to make more and more difficult, desperate choices.
They're asking the federal government for a $10 billion contingency fund to help keep the sector afloat, as well as other measures like bigger tax breaks for donors. The Prime Minister says there is an announcement coming for the charitable sector, but in the meantime, he says Canadians can also take action themselves.
Think of how you can lend a hand to help others through this tough time.
The charities say they need that money now more than they ever have before. Catherine Cullen, CBC News, Ottawa.
It should soon become apparent if all this self-isolation is paying off. As Philip Lishanok tells us, health officials are looking for signs that the spread of the virus is slowing.
Next week will be very, very important in terms of looking at those trends.
Canada's Chief Medical Officer of Health, Dr. Theresa Tam, says Canadians are now catching 2/3 of all COVID-19 cases in their own communities. And we'll soon see if orders to physically distance are making any difference.
I'm certainly watching very closely what's happening in Quebec and Ontario in particular, but also Alberta, of course. All of these areas have had reports of community transmission.
Physical isolation may be hardest for those in poorer neighborhoods, and there's evidence that suggests that those areas may bear the brunt of the pandemic. The borough of Queens, one of New York's poorest neighborhoods, has a third of that city's 30,000 cases. Suman Roy runs the Scarborough Food Security Initiative. The grassroots volunteer organization has been delivering donated food to families in the Toronto suburb ever since the local food bank closed because of COVID-19.
What's happening in a lot of cases is they don't have a choice what they're getting out because they need food.
He says people living below the poverty line may not have the option of ordering groceries online, so it's hard to follow orders to stay at home.
Biggest issue right now are the high-rise towers. When we show up and there is 200 people standing in the lobby hungry and asking for food.
And Roy says public health messaging needs to include where to call to get help. Across Canada, 211 is a source of information about community-based health and social services, open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Daniele Zanotti is CEO of the United Way Toronto and York region. He says the 211 service also helps to gauge where resources should be concentrated.
They triage calls, they connect it back into this network of agencies, and it gives us real-time data of what are the needs that are emerging.
Because he says without support, hungry people will stop physically distancing. Philip Shannock, CBC News, Toronto.
And the country's chief medical officer of health, Theresa Tam, has issued a correction. About 12% of Canadians who are hospitalized with COVID-19 are under the age of 40. Tam said yesterday that number was much higher. Quebec has nearly half of all the cases of COVID-19 in Canada, but Premier François Legault says there are encouraging signs. Quebec reported no new deaths today. And as Matt Demore tells us, while there are nearly 350 new cases, the number each day is shrinking.
C'est comme ça qu'on va gagner la bataille de notre vie.
Premier François Legault calls the response to COVID-19 the fight of our lives, and he says he's encouraged by how that fight is going. The number of deaths attributed to the coronavirus stands at 22, and there are now 2,840 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Quebec, a roughly 14% increase since yesterday. Daily increases last week had been over 20%.
We can see that the daily increase in confirmed cases seems to be stabilizing. Public health authorities
red light camera in 100 meters.
Paying off, so don't give up.
Calling seniors the most vulnerable people in this pandemic, Legault said new aid is coming for Quebec's long-term care homes and stricter rules for access to the facilities. Quebec put in place other measures this weekend, including checkpoints in 8 of the province's regions to limit access and slow the spread of the virus. The closure of many tourist accommodations and the cancellation of stays booked over the next 2 weeks. That includes resorts, youth hostels, and short-term rentals like Airbnb. Quebec's public health director, Horacio Arruda, says today's numbers are encouraging, but the conclusions can't be drawn based on one day. Known for his animated presence at the daily briefings, Arruda talked about the importance of flattening the curve, using his closed fist to strike down an imaginary line.
The curve that we projected, actually we are under. We are not still attained the plateau because we are stretching it. Path, path, path from this high curve.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked today if there are discussions of deploying armed forces members to help manage the pandemic, including in Quebec. He said there have been no requests and no plan to do so for now. Premier Legault said things are currently under control and he thinks police are up to the task. Matt Demore, CBC News, Montreal.
Nova Scotia's premier is applying further restrictions for people who ignore the province's state of emergency. Stephen McNeil also has a message for those who are not taking isolation seriously. Carolyn Ray reports.
It was a stunning weekend in Nova Scotia. So nice, some couldn't resist the temptation. They left their homes and headed to the parks and beaches that are currently out of bounds.
The reckless few? Shame on you.
The sunny skies are exactly what Premier Stephen McNeil did not want to see. Today, as he finished his daily briefing, the Premier took aim at the people ignoring the order to stay home. He showed photos of busy parking lots and scolded those he calls the reckless few.
Not only am I upset and Dr. Strang is upset, your fellow Nova Scotians are upset with you.
Yesterday, Halifax Regional Police had to kick a number of people out of a park. They issued verbal warnings and then wrapped police tape around the property to keep others out.
When the reckless few blatantly disobey Dr. Strang's orders and kids see you outside acting like everything is normal, you're confusing them and putting them in harm's way.
McNeil says those verbal warnings are now over. Police are being told to issue tickets and tow vehicles that are breaking the state of emergency. Those reckless few could face a $1,000 fine every time they're caught. The Premier points out that the sooner they listen, the sooner this ends. Carolyn Ray, CBC News, Halifax.
U.S. President Donald Trump is updating physical distancing guidelines for Americans.